What if I told you that one of the greatest civilizations in history, responsible for building the pyramids, mummifying their dead, and ruling for over 3,000 years, did all of that in one of the harshest environments on Earth? Without running water? Yeah, no pipes, no plumbing, just blazing heat, sandstorms, and a sun so unforgiving it could bake bread on a stone. And yet, the ancient Egyptians didn't just survive the desert, they thrived in it. So how did they do it? How did millions of people build massive cities, grow crops, stay hydrated, and even perform complex medical procedures in a place where most people today wouldn't last 48 hours without air conditioning and a water bottle? Was it some kind of ancient desert sorcery? Was the Nile River their magic trick? Or did they crack a code that we've completely forgotten? In this video, we're digging deep into the secrets of how ancient Egyptians mastered the desert. From mind-blowing irrigation systems to water-conserving diets, desert hacks you've never heard of, and the genius architecture that kept them cool without fans, get ready for one of the smartest survival stories in human history, because, while we're struggling with heat waves and droughts today, the Egyptians figured it out 5,000 years ago. And once you see how they did it, you'll never look at a glass of water the same way again. Let's dive in. Picture this, it's 2500 BCE. The sun is merciless, the desert stretches endlessly in every direction, and not a single cloud hangs in the sky. You're in the heart of ancient Egypt, and the temperature is so brutal it feels like the earth itself is on fire. You'd think no one could survive here, let alone build a kingdom that would last for thousands of years. But right in the middle of this dry, golden hellscape, something incredible is happening. A city is rising, stone temples are being carved, markets are buzzing, farmers are planting crops, and at the center of it all, the lifeline that made it possible, the Nile River, snakes its way through the chaos, calm and eternal. Now here's where things get wild. Even with the Nile, this wasn't easy. Most of the land in Egypt totally uninhabitable. The desert wasn't just dry, it was deadly. And the river, while essential, flooded unpredictably. One year, it would bring life. The next, it would bring famine. So how did the Egyptians not just survive this chaos, but turn it into one of the most advanced civilizations the world has ever seen? Let me tell you about the village of El Kab. El Kab was a small, ancient city on the east bank of the Nile. Not a capital, not a palace city, just regular people trying to live. And yet, archaeologists have discovered something fascinating about this place. It had zero access to fresh, flowing water most of the year. And still, the people here thrived. How? They didn't rely on wells or springs. They built massive underground cisterns to collect every drop of rainwater. They dug channels from the Nile during flood season and stored the excess in giant clay-lined reservoirs. They even created shady courtyards and wind tunnels in their homes to keep water from evaporating too fast. That's not just surviving, that's engineering mastery. So while we picture ancient Egypt as a place of gods and pharaohs, the real story starts with everyday people like the ones in El Kab. People who stared down the desert and figured out how to outsmart it drop by precious drop, and that's just the beginning. Because this one village is a microcosm of an entire empire that built its survival on understanding one simple truth. If you control water, you control life. And the Egyptians, they controlled it better than anyone else in history. So how did ancient Egyptians go from barely surviving in the harsh desert to mastering the art of water management? It all started with one crucial realization. The Nile was everything. But not in the way you might think. At first glance, the Nile looks like just another river. But for the Egyptians, it wasn't just a water source, it was a seasonal miracle. Every year, like clockwork, the river would flood its banks, spilling mineral-rich silt across the valley. This flood cycle was predictable, dependable, and absolutely vital. It turned a narrow strip of desert into the most fertile farmland in the ancient world. But here's the problem, the flood didn't last. For most of the year, the Nile was calm, even shallow. The moment the waters receded, the burning heat would return, and everything not touched by the flood would dry up in days. If you didn't act fast, if you didn't capture that flood water and store it, you were done. This was the moment that transformed Egyptian society. Around 3000 BCE, just as the first dynasties were forming, Egyptian communities started organizing themselves around the rhythms of the river. Farmers, priests, and engineers began working together, not because they wanted to, they had to. And this is when one of history's earliest large-scale water management systems began to emerge. The government got involved. The pharaohs didn't just rule through military power, they became managers of the flood. They organized massive labor forces to dig irrigation canals, build embankments, and carve out basins to trap floodwater for later use. These weren't temporary fixes, these were generational projects, passed down like sacred knowledge. Imagine hundreds of workers with nothing but copper tools and determination carving out channels in 100-degree heat, just so the village could plant barley when the water disappeared. And what really made it work? Measurement. The Egyptians invented a system to track the river's behavior. It was called a Nilometer, basically an ancient river gauge carved into the stone. Every year priests would measure how high the river rose. If the floods were too low, they prepared for famine. If they were too high, they braced for destruction. But when the floods hit the sweet spot, that meant life, prosperity, and enough food to feed millions. This system didn't just keep people alive, it turned water into political power. Whoever controlled the canals controlled the crops, and whoever controlled the crops controlled the kingdom. So yes, Egypt was built in the desert, but it was ruled by those who could manage the flood. The real story of ancient Egypt wasn't just about pharaohs and pyramids, it was about a nation that figured out how to turn disaster into opportunity by learning how to bend water to their will. If the Nile was Egypt's heart, then basin irrigation was the circulatory system that kept it alive. Around 3000 BCE, the Egyptians figured out that the Nile's floodwaters weren't a threat, they were an opportunity. So they engineered a system that would make modern farmers blush. They built massive earthen embankments to trap and direct floodwaters into specially designed fields called basins. Each basin acted like a natural bathtub. When the river swelled during its annual inundation, water would flow into these enclosed plots. Once trapped, the water would sit for weeks, seeping into the soil and depositing a thick layer of nutrient-rich silt. After the flood receded, farmers had a short but powerful window to plant and harvest crops, mainly wheat, barley, and flax. This single cycle of flooding, soaking, and sowing sustained millions of people for centuries. And here's the best part, they didn't use pumps, motors, or advanced machinery. It was all gravity. Nature did the heavy lifting. All the Egyptians had to do was understand it, and that's exactly what they did. So the next time someone talks about ancient technology as primitive, remind them, these people were irrigating entire civilizations with just mud, patience, and genius. But what happened when the floodwaters didn't reach far enough? Enter the shaduf, possibly the most underrated piece of ancient tech ever created. Invented around 2000 BCE, the shaduf was basically a giant seesaw with a bucket on one end and a rock or counterweight on the other. Farmers would lower the bucket into a canal or river, scoop up water, and let the counterweight pull the bucket back up. Simple, right? But this tool changed everything. The shaduf made it possible to irrigate higher ground areas far from the floodplain. That meant more crops, more food, and more stability for the empire. Suddenly, desert edges weren't dead zones, they were farmland. And it wasn't just the elite who used it. Everyday farmers relied on shadufs to feed their families. It became such a staple of Egyptian life that you can still find people using them in rural parts of Egypt today, over 4,000 years later. The brilliance of the shaduf wasn't its complexity, it was its accessibility. It democratized water access at a time when water literally meant life. As the Egyptian population boomed, they needed more than a bucket and lever system. That's when innovation leveled up, with the arrival of the saqiyas. Around the 3rd century BCE, engineers developed the saqiyas, a water-lifting device that ran on muscle and mechanics. It looked like a Ferris wheel made of clay pots, mounted on a horizontal axle. Animals like oxen or donkeys would walk in a circle, turning gears that rotated the wheel. As the wheel spun, pots scooped water from a well or canal and poured it into elevated aqueducts, non-stop, no breaks, no waiting. This wasn't just irrigation, it was industrial-scale hydration. With the saqiyas, Egyptians could cultivate vast plots of land that were previously unreachable. It also allowed them to water crops during dry spells, giving them some control over a climate that was anything but predictable. The saqiyas transformed farming from a seasonal gamble into a year-round enterprise. and it paved the way for complex agricultural planning that fed cities, temples, and armies. But none of these inventions, basins, shadufs, saqiyas, would have mattered without one key factor. The Egyptians understood that water wasn't just a resource, it was a form of power. They didn't just manage water, they controlled it. They built canals to reroute it, embankments to store it, and rituals to honor it. Water wasn't just physical, it was political, spiritual, and economic. The priests of Hapi, the Nile god, were revered not just for their religious role, but because they were gatekeepers of the flood. Pharaohs often measured their success by how well they maintained the irrigation systems. In other words, whoever controlled the water, controlled Egypt. And that's how a civilization surrounded by desert for thousands of miles didn't just survive, but thrived, built pyramids and shaped the ancient world. Here's the twist nobody saw coming. What happens when your only water source turns on you? For thousands of years, the ancient Egyptians relied on the Nile like a heartbeat. It rose, it fell, it flooded, and like clockwork it kept their entire civilization alive. But then, something changed. In certain years, especially during extended droughts or rare climate shifts, the Nile didn't flood. No rich black silt, no overflowing fields, no harvest. And when the flood didn't come, everything fell apart. Farms dried up, food supplies dwindled, people starved. The careful balance that Egyptians had maintained for generations suddenly became a nightmare. Temples went silent, grain prices skyrocketed, and panic took hold. It wasn't just a water shortage, it was a spiritual crisis. The Nile was a god to them. And now, it felt like the gods had stopped listening. This is when the genius of Egyptian survival truly showed. They built reserve granaries, began to ration food, and turned to rituals and sacrifices in an attempt to bring the floods back. Pharaohs would even launch massive state relief programs redistributing grain from royal storage to feed their people. But imagine being a farmer during this time, watching your fields crack under the sun, while priests chant prayers that go unanswered. It's hard to believe, but that was the reality. Their entire civilization was always one failed flood away from collapse. It's a reminder, no matter how smart or resourceful, nature always had the final say. And somehow they survived that too. But that brings us to one last question. How did they keep bouncing back? How did an ancient desert empire not only avoid extinction but thrive for 3,000 years? That's the final piece of the puzzle, and it's coming up in the last chapter. So, how did they do it? How did the ancient Egyptians manage to survive and even thrive in a land where the sun shows no mercy, the rain barely falls, and their entire future depended on a river that could vanish without warning? The answer is both simple and profound. They planned like their lives depended on it. Because they did. Egyptian survival wasn't just about buckets and canals, it was about creating a civilization-wide system that turned water into a strategy. Every village, every temple, every field was part of a larger network built on anticipation, precision, and control. They tracked the flood patterns of the Nile for generations. They engineered calendars to know exactly when the river would rise. They designed a government so centralized that the pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was the manager of water, literally. He decided when the fields would be sown, and when the grain would be distributed. And they didn't stop at farming. Egyptians stored water, developed early sanitation systems, and adapted their daily routines to conserve every drop. Their architecture was designed to block sunlight, channel airflow, and reduce the body's need for water. Even their culture reflected this. From spiritual rituals honoring the gods of water, to strict laws about irrigation, to mythology that embedded nature into every story, water wasn't just a resource, it was their identity. In modern times we turn on a faucet and forget how miraculous it is. But the Egyptians knew the value of water. They treated it like gold, because in their world, it was. So, the next time you find yourself sweating in summer or annoyed at a low-pressure shower, just remember this. The ancient Egyptians built pyramids, ran empires, and fed millions, without a single drop of running water. If they could do that, what excuse do we have? If you learned something new or just got a deeper appreciation for ancient ingenuity, hit that like button and subscribe. More untold stories of history and hidden genius are coming every week. Let me know in the comments, what do you think was their most impressive innovation? Was it the canals, the grain reserves, the solar architecture? Thanks for watching, and as always, stay curious.